Following on from our short lesson on autosomal inheritance, we're now going to look at a second of 4 different modes of inheritance, today's lesson being on sex-linked inheritance. Before we dive into sex-linked inheritance, it's important again that we talk about which particular chromosomes sex-linked inheritance traits affect. So I'll show you in a second our karyotypes once again, and our karyotypes are simply a map of all chromosomes in the human body. In our last lesson, when we spoke about autosomal inheritance, we looked at these 22 pairs of autosomes in the body. The focus of today's lesson, however, is on one pair, and that pair in particular is the sex chromosomes. Now, within each homologous pair of sex chromosomes, one comes from the mother and one comes from the father. So when we talk about the male and female sex, it is largely determined by which sex chromosomes are inherited from the mother and, most importantly, what is inherited from the father. Mothers will always pass on their X chromosome to their offspring, which means that the father is the one who determines the offspring. If the father provides an X chromosome, then the offspring will be female. If the father provides a Y chromosome, the offspring will be male. This means that females, again, only pass on an X chromosome, as it's the only chromosome they have. However, it's one of their 2 copies. Males, however, can either pass on that X or Y chromosome. So, to recap, when we talk about the sex of the offspring, it is always determined by the male. So I have one karyotype here. We'll get to another in a second. And in this karyotype, we can clearly identify, firstly, our 22 pairs of autosomes. These autosomes are all of our somatic chromosomes. They control things in the body, again, such as hair or eye colour. On the other hand, down in the bottom right-hand corner, we have these final 2 chromosomes. We have 2 X chromosomes and no Y chromosomes in this organism. And in this particular human, this is going to mean that this human is female at birth. Scrolling down, we now have another karyotype, and in this karyotype, we can see, again, our 22 pairs or 44 autosomes, and we also have our 2 sex chromosomes down the bottom right-hand corner. This time, we don't have 2 copies of the X. We have one X, and we have the smaller chromosome, Y. And in this case, this human will be male. When we have a look at sex-linked inheritance, in Year 11, we specifically talk about X-linked inheritance. We talk about the inheritance of traits passed down through the X chromosome. Y-linked inheritance does exist, but it is beyond the scope of this course. So for our sake, we are only going to look at genes found on that X chromosome. Now, we can see in our diagram here, the Y chromosome is in blue, and it's very small when we compare it to the X chromosome. And what this means is that the Y chromosome has less genes than the X chromosome, which also means for us that most of the genes in the X chromosome will lack matching alleles in a male. When we have a look at sex-linked inheritance Punnett squares now and the inheritance of these sex-linked characteristics, we need to first start by representing the individual sex chromosomes themselves. So our X and our Y. What I'm doing now is I'm just highlighting each of the X chromosomes in yellow. I'll then show each of my Y chromosomes in green. And we can see in the Punnett square itself, so if I do a quick border around the Punnett square itself, there is always going to be a 50% chance of female offspring on the left-hand side and a 50% chance of male offspring. What we're now interested in is the particular alleles on the X chromosome. So in blue, I'll highlight our dominant trait, and we can see that the dominant trait is passed down from father and mother to this individual in our top right-hand corner, and we end up with an individual who is homozygous dominant. Down in the bottom left, however, the mother in this instance is a heterozygote, and this means that when the father passes down a dominant allele to his daughters or potential daughters, the mother can pass on this recessive allele. And what this produces, it is a heterozygous female offspring. So females, in theory, can be one of three particular things. They could be homozygous dominant, heterozygotes, or homozygous recessive. Now, it's beyond the scope of this particular Punnett square, but I'll write it just below here, where females, there is a third possible option. Males, however, a word we'll get to in a second, is hemizygous. And what this means for our males is that they can either be dominant for a trait, because they only inherit one copy of the trait on the X chromosome, or they can have the recessive allele. They do not get the option of being carriers. So when we put this into words, a recessive allele carried on the X chromosome is always going to be masked by the presence of a dominant allele in females. However, this is simply not possible in males, as they only have the one X chromosome, and the Y chromosome doesn't necessarily carry matching copies. So when we look at a particular example, being colour blindness, we see that the incidence of colour blindness is much higher in males, because they have no opportunity to hide that particular trait, to mask it with the dominant allele. So the word that we use for this is hemizygous. And we can see in our table down the bottom here that males can be hemizygous dominant, which in this case would result in normal vision, or males can be hemizygous recessive, resulting in red-green colour blindness. Now, females who inherit two copies of the recessive allele, homozygous recessive, they too will be red-green colourblind. However, in females who are homozygous dominant, they will have normal vision, and even in females who are heterozygous for this particular trait, they will still have normal vision. So let's walk through a Punnett square example using red-green colour blindness now. The question reads, red-green colour blindness is a recessive sex-linked trait. A normal-sighted woman whose father is red-green colourblind marries a colourblind man. Determine the phenotypic ratio they would expect in their children. So to start off, we need to pick some alleles. So for colour blindness, I'm going to pick the allele B and B. Now, we've been told that this is a recessive sex-linked trait, which means that our little or lowercase b here is going to result in colour blindness, or red-green colour blindness to be specific, and our dominant allele here will be normal vision or no colour blindness. When we talk about the parent phenotypes, we've been told quite nicely here at the start that we have a normal sighted woman, so normal sight or normal vision, and that is a cross with a colourblind male. So when we're representing the genotypes now, it's important that we start by writing out the particular sex chromosomes. So in the case of our normal-sighted woman, it will be XX. And in the case of our colourblind male, it will be XY. Now you'll note for the cross here that I've made my cross in the middle quite prominent and quite different, as I don't want to get it confused with my X chromosomes. So when we talk about our colourblind male, well, he's a hemizygote, which means in this case the colourblind male must inherit the one trait on his one X chromosome, so he will have a lowercase b. The female, however, we know has normal sight, which means she must have at least one dominant copy of the allele, but the second allele on her other X chromosome can vary. It could be normal vision or it could be colour blindness. Fortunately, in this question, we've been told the father is red-green colourblind, which means that she must have inherited at least the copy of colour blindness from her father. Again, the father only has one copy of the allele, is the only one that the father can pass down. So we now have our parent genotypes and phenotypes, so we're going to draw our Punnett square up here. And once we're done with our Punnett square, I'm going to represent both parents in the Punnett square. So in this instance, I'll start with my female along my top, and I'll write my male off to the left-hand side. Before I fill in any alleles here, I'm going to start by including all of my sex chromosomes. Once I've included my sex chromosomes, I can then start filling in each of my alleles. So starting in the top left, from the mother we inherit a dominant allele and from the father a recessive. In the right-hand side of this, we now inherit 2 copies of the recessive allele. For the male portion, the bottom left square of our Punnett now, we inherit a dominant allele from the mother, and from our mother, we also may inherit a recessive copy of the allele. Now, in terms of our genotypes in this particular instance, the question again has asked us for a ratio, so we are going to represent these as 1 copy of a heterozygous female to 1 copy of a homozygous recessive female to 1 copy of a hemizygous affected male and 1 copy of a hemizygous recessive male. Now, when we talk about our phenotypes, it's important that we represent each of these with both the correct sex and the correct alleles. So in this instance, our phenotype for this particular woman at the start, for this particular offspring, would be 1 heterozygous female, or in this instance, a heterozygote will have normal vision female to 1 colorblind female. And now we can see clearly that we have 1 normal vision male and 1 colorblind male. So this here has been a quick Punnett square, so starting again with our alleles before getting into our phenotypes and genotypes of the parental generation, drawing our Punnett square, and then clearly stating the genotype and the phenotypes for our first generation. So some quick rules to wrap up. When we talk about sex-linked recessive traits, it's important that we understand that pretty much every single affected by a sex-linked trait will be male. And this is just because they have no availability to mask that trait. If it's in their family, they have a pretty high likelihood of it being passed on. I'm going to skip over the second point here, but our third point, where all sons of affected men married to normal women will also be normal. And this is because they receive a Y from their father and either the normal X from their mother. The fourth point here also explains why more males end up with an X-linked inheritance being expressed. It's because all daughters in this instance will be carriers because they receive an affected X from their father, but again, a normal X chromosome from their mother. When we talk statistically, on average, a carrier woman married to a normal man is going to produce sons with a 50% probability of being sufferers and daughters who have a 0.5 probability of being carriers. So the most common examples of this include what we've just looked at with red-green colour blindness and what we will wrap up here with now on haemophilia. So haemophilia is another example of a sex-linked recessive trait, and haemophilia results in blood clots which form really slowly or not at all. Now, males can either have the condition or not have the condition. They are hemizygotes. They cannot be heterozygotes. Females, on the other hand, have the ability to be heterozygous. They can also be homozygous normal or homozygous affected. So in the case of haemophilia, if a homozygous haemophiliac mother has a son, he must also have haemophilia.